What's up, folks? Casual Dad here with the next in our series of Warhammer combat cards, Warlord guides. And you may have noticed I've been going ahead and recording these and scheduling them out in advance. I'm trying really hard not to put out too many of these too quickly, but I do want to make sure I get through all of them in a reasonable time frame. But tonight we're going to do a double header, because at the moment I'm recording this, there's an active Tyranids campaign where you may actually want to play around with the Parasite of Mortrex, who is our current one-up, if you do have him. So this is the Parasite of Mortrex, a Tyranid Warlord, coming in at the cheaper end, I believe second cheapest of the Tyranid Warlords, and a really, really fun one. It's a weird one, so we're going to talk about the ability in a second, but just in terms of like the feel of the Warlord, this one is hyper aggressive, but also very strategic, and just a really interesting piece. It's a late addition. I believe it's also the most recently added Tyranid Warlord, and it's one that clearly was added to the meta with the aim of being a meta disruptive piece, because it trades extremely well with several of the strongest meta pieces and is almost unique in being one of the only melee-focused warlords that can do extra damage to adjacent cards. So we're looking at Logan Grimnar and then the Parasite are the only two melee warlords who, by default, just by using their ability, can deal damage off lane. And we're going to talk about that just a second here. But first we'll look at the stats. Again, reasonably cheap, but actually on the pricey side for the stats that you get. This is a tricky one to balance because it can be a little bit overwhelming. And when it was initially released, actually, it was much weaker. Just in terms of the trait had just lower percentage values, and it was buffed shortly after, and now is quite a scary piece. But as you can also see, it has pretty terrible stats. We're looking at 30 cost, 188 hit points is teeny tiny. It's rare, so it only has the single trait, and has Furious Charge as that single trait. Even at max, it's good, but it's a card you don't want to play on the board, or you want to have absolute choice and control about when you play it on the board at a key moment. But so with this, let's go ahead and look at the ability. The first time an enemy bodyguard is attacked by a friendly Tyranid melee attack, it deals 60%, just over half damage, and the target becomes infested. When an infested card dies, it deals 40% of its base wounds as damage to adjacent cards. So it turns enemy cards into death blows for you, which is awesome. And on that note, this is any kind of melee attack, so including a death blow or a furious charge, both will trigger this infest option for infestation on that card. So you can drop a card that has Furious Charge, it will do the reduced damage on its Furious Charge, and then follow up with a full strength attack when you actually do a melee attack in follow-up. Now it's extremely melee focused, so you can have bad matchups on that alone if you hit another melee focused opponent. Also, it relies on a bit of precision here. Let me pull that back up. Relies on quite a bit of precision because you want to pick your targets well. And you do, and I'll talk more about this in the actual games we'll play in a minute. And then you also want to make sure that it does hit targets in the right order. So hyper aggressive, but also a little bit slow because you set up your ability in advance and then you trigger it. So you've got a double stage thing going on. But then also it ends up being very strategic and somewhat slow for a very aggressive warlord. So I really love it, but it's been very tricky to play around with. And it's been a lot of experimentation kind of to get where we are. So this is the deck that I've been using, and this also is fairly level dependent. The Parasite relies on having both high hit points and then also having high level traits on your cards, and then lastly having high melee damage, because you do need your cards to hit very hard to overcome the reduced damage in the first hit, and then also really be able to finish off opposing cards to trigger those quote-unquote death blow abilities there. So I've got a couple death blow cards in here. I've got 3 of them actually. This one is one that's particularly powerful that really benefits from being higher level, because if you get just below this, that 58 base melee damage is not high enough. You need more. So level 6 is the first part where he truly becomes a decent piece in this deck with the Parasite. You can use him earlier, but you will find that there are better things for the cost that have a better base melee damage. But this guy has both high hit points, he's also got high melee damage, and has death blow to either trigger an initial blast of the infest or set off an existing infest and just do extra damage and take down extra shields to give your deck some extra momentum that it could otherwise kind of lack. Similar story for the Moloch. Very, very high base melee damage, high hit points, and has that death blow as well to really kind of hammer home the momentum here. Because that's one thing about the Parasite is you have all this ability, but you are really exposing yourself by melee, 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 and so you need to get the meaningful kills and make sure that everything that dies counts in a very dramatic way, both on your side and your opponent's side. One of the single best cards in the deck is going to be the Death Leaper. Again, a legendary, so I've got 2 legendaries in here that really define the deck. You can build without them, but it is fairly challenging. This being a really cool time for Tyranids, we just got a bunch of new cards released. You will have more options to kind of fill this out, but again, you do need fairly highly leveled cards to really benefit the most from the Parasite. So this guy again has that outflank to beef up your melee attacks and debuff offense, so it's a defensive ability. Has okay hit points once you get to higher level, and has a very high melee attack, plus that Furious Charge, to either finish off an injured card or apply Infect before hitting that in the follow-up melee. Also has that range debuff in case of bad matchups where you're getting shot a lot. Gives you a little bit of extra defense there too. So a really great all-around piece for this. And you can look for cards that are similar to this, that emulate this in your collection if you don't have the Death Leaper or don't have it high level. Then of course we kind of fill it out. We've got a Medicae in here that I just like to have. He does have a melee attack, so in addition to being a cheap Medicae to help keep your heavy hitters alive, he can also apply Infect, and his melee attack is so low it doesn't matter if he doesn't do significant damage in the process. He can also do ranged and clear shields, and with key positioning can actually finish off injured cards, especially Akaran cards or anything that's very low health. So don't totally discount him, but don't expect him to do a bunch of damage. And then this guy, of course, is kind of a filler too. Same story, but also has that Furious Charge to apply Infect or finish off injured cards at key moments. So a lot of this I'm talking about like the strategic play with this Warlord, which I really love about it, but does make it challenging. They just recently changed Chirda to Endless, which is good to hold down a lane. Also does have both ranged and melee to help apply Infects, finish off injured cards, and just kind of gum up the works, as it were. And then, of course, we have our Target Acquired. Your basic Target Acquired, and I do really recommend having Target Acquired in the deck, because if there's one really big beefy thing opposite you, this is the ideal card to focus that down and then get the maximum benefit of that card's bulk in that Death Blow ability that triggers after. All right, I'm talking a lot. Last piece is our Mucilid Spore, the just cheap Death Blow with melee, and there are 2 of these that you can use now, with this one coming in at a cheaper price point. So if you're short on points or short on the deck points, this guy is arguably better. The only purpose of these is really to be there to apply Infect broadly to the board, because if one of those is in the middle, that Death Blow will trigger Infect to every single card on the opposing board, which is awesome, because that both will mean that your follow-up melee hit will hit at full power rather than being reduced to apply the Infect, and also it does infect multiple cards at once, which is very nice. Of course, a key part to keep your cards alive is going to be your taunt cards, especially this clutch little boy, that 4-point taunt, which I absolutely love, but didn't really put in this deck because these fillers made a little bit more sense with the hyper aggression. I would kind of skip past most of these. This guy's a great piece because if the opposing deck has a lot of debuffs, this guy can help compensate for that and make sure that your meaningful hits are as meaningful as you need them to be. He's not great himself, but that high level melee ready makes a big difference in terms of your back hitting power. Poison is also a valuable piece to have in this deck because once the card is infected, if it dies to any attack, it will then trigger that Death Blow. So that's an important thing to remember, is it doesn't have to be a melee attack that gets the kill. You just want to make sure that the deck is full of melee attacks so you are properly applying stacks of your Infect. This guy, of course, coming in as one of the newer cards, as just spectacular stats for the price and that melee ready. Just a dramatically better version of this guy, but of course coming in at almost double the points. So depending on what points you have or what levels you have, great piece to add, but just be cautious of that. This one, of course, being another great piece because of that Furious Charge. Another great one to throw in here for the stats and the cost. Again, we've got another taunt. This guy's not bad. I actually initially had this guy in here instead of the chosen guy up here, just because he's cheaper. He does the similar thing with the Berserk, but doesn't have that Death Blow. So I had him in there before I'd gotten this guy leveled up to the point where he got Death Blow. This guy's an interesting piece. Fantastic. Once you get him leveled up, good stats for the price point. Pure melee, but has fear and a melee ready once you get to that level 9. So if you have this guy highly leveled, also a strong piece to consider. I'm excited to use him just because that freaky model. We mentioned the importance of Death Blow, so this guy's another good one too. We talked about Target Acquired, so once I get this guy higher level, he is a perfect piece. He's got a higher price point, but great stats, great melee attack, and the melee ready and Target Acquired combo. A perfect piece to round out the deck. And if you are playing max level campaigns, this is a great one to throw in there to really, really help supercharge your deck there. Now we've got some other pieces down at the bottom here. These are getting more expensive, so there's definitely kind of a challenge. These ones, of course, being incredibly powerful, both having targeted card and great stats, but of course taking forever to level. This one I do not recommend because he's just a little bit too evenly spread between cost, hit points, and stats. He does have Berserk, but he just doesn't really scale enough to justify the cost when just a little bit more will get you the Moloch. This guy is an interesting piece because he does have the melee to apply the Infect and then has a very strong ranged attack to finish off infected cards. So you can go ahead and put him in there. So you can do a Parasite that's actually very ranged focused, but has the melee abilities to go ahead and apply those Infects. So you can do heavy ranged cards with a melee attack and then sprinkle in some of your Mucolid Spores to get the Infect off and then shoot them off the board. You can do that. I tried some of those hybrids, including a Psychic one with this guy too. Similar story, just with Psychic. I did not find it as effective as pure melee. These two guys I wouldn't necessarily consider either because they have a lot of bulk, but they don't have the hitting power that other similarly costed cards do. This one is a similar story to your Shielded Shooter. Is a melee-focused ranged card with Berserk. Is a good one to do because that Barrage does actually help kind of double combo, will finish off injured cards, but then also helps clear shields, and is a nice return fire you can have if you are hitting in melee, which this guy's melee focused, and if you're getting shot back. So good flexible piece, better price point than some of the others, but is still high enough to trigger Big Game Hunter, so you want to watch out for that. Similar story with this guy here, kind of the same thing. This is a good piece to consider, especially if you have a high leveled one, because he hits a very high melee stat very early and has regen to keep him on the board a little longer, and just like Death Leaper, has that ranged debuff for defense. And then, of course, just a really nice price point for the hitting power you get. He was in my initial versions of the deck. Really great one. And this one, of course, is also a truly excellent piece to have in here. Just, oof, man, Inspiring Presence, Furious Charge, great stats. Like, if you have him at decent level, include this guy too. So there we go. I've talked a ton. Those are kind of the highlights, and there's just a ton of variety you can put in here. But again, the combination I have is so far the best I've found. We're going to knock out our 2 games before this video gets too long, and then we will let it fly. Da 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 da. Ooh yeah. Great and terrible matchup. So the Parasite's ability for bonus damage is based on the starting initial health of the target you hit. So Greyfax's bonus health won't be factored in, so something even that looks pretty beefy when you're playing it with Greyfax in the deck, it looks like a really positive thing to hit, but it's not going to deal significant damage. Alright, and she's going first, so I am going to go ahead and leave that dude in there. So this is still, it is a good matchup because, again, you can do really melee-focused attacks, and most Greyfax decks are not particularly good in melee, and then still have the overflow damage. So I will, despite being overstatted, because the stats on a Greyfax deck are extremely high, I will have the opportunity here to make a big difference. And that wasn't probably the best play, but we put him in there. So pick your targets. You want to pick one with decently high hit points, and you'll see, boom, did the extra 40 damage to this guy, extra damage to him. One of the things that makes the Parasite so good is that extra damage goes under shields. So it doesn't clear shields, which is important to note when you're kind of strategizing, but it goes under shields and ignores fear. So it's just like Barrage in some ways, and then a little bit better because it goes through shields. So it's a really powerful combination of abilities. But let's see here. And this is going to be a tough matchup. He's only got 2 cards left in the deck, but a lot of health on the board. But the good news is that I've already got the Infest on the Kulexis, which has good base hit points. So even though I won't get the bonus hit points for the Greyfax buff, I still will get those base hit points, which will be really good. Ooh, that's going to hurt. And I still have some of my heaviest hitters in the deck, but I'm getting dangerously close to having to play the Parasite itself, which you don't want. Now, one of the things that makes this guy coolest and most complicated is you can set off a cascade. So if I hit this one on the right hard enough, if she dies, she probably will do enough overflow damage to finish off the Kulexis. We'll also do his damage to the guy on the left. So Let's see if we can pull that off. It really depends on how much damage each one does, and I'm still not great at doing the math here. So if I am able to kill the guy in the middle, that will comfortably take out the guy on the left. And it did. Sweet. That was a very helpful turn. Unfortunately, my positioning is awful to take down Greyfax herself. So this still is probably a loss. I am actively laddering with my Tyranids right now, so this is kind of, I am starting to hit more challenging matchups. But we'll see how it goes. I'm glad we have the Endless, but still, that's going to be Parasite on the deck, which is not great. Luckily, oh, and it's a really high level Canoness, great. And what sucks here, or not Canoness, sorry, Inquisitor. One thing that really sucks here is I would want to be able to trigger the Death Blow attack on the Navigator, but I ran out of cards too quickly. Another thing that sucks here is I kind of have to hit this, and I don't want to use Psychic, and she's got all attack types, so I may be able to pull this out. My guess is she's got enough damage on me, especially with this guy, and then she's got the buffs in both melee and range, so she's got me. But had I had, and that, so there is a downside of having the full deck, is that of course your draws are not great. You don't always have control of being able to play the exact cards you want in the first couple turns. You may have to clear some of the other ones. So there's definitely, if you have very durable Tyranid cards that also have high melee, you can build this deck out with, say, 2 fewer than your total upgrades, or total card slots. Anytime now. There we go. So you could do, instead of an 8 bodyguard deck, you could do a 6. Just with more heavier hitters and more death blow, and that can in some ways be better, but I personally found that I really struggled in a lot of matchups with not having enough bodies to keep the Parasite off the board. Once your Parasite gets to really high level, you can be a little bit more comfortable putting it on the board, but it takes a while to get there. So your Berserk cards and your death blow cards are ones you want to play very early on, especially if you're going to see something like that. Oh, gross. Good news here is that that's a full deck, and the AI has given me an absolute gift in deploying it backwards, so that everything left in there is probably going to be an endless sub 10-point card to go ahead and build up Zodgrod's bonuses, but since they're coming out here, that's awesome. Downside, of course, being I'm just going to get annihilated. And here you can see how advantageous it would have been to have one of the shielded ranged, or the, so in both of these matchups, I could just as easily have done, okay, 1 shield left, that is good, we'll go ahead and take that down. I could have done one of the ranged or psychic combo Parasite decks and been a little bit better off, just because I would have had the additional attack types. So there's certainly something to consider there with different builds. By no means is my build, even though it's the one that I personally have settled on, by no means is it the be-all, end-all of the build or the best you could possibly do. And this is kind of great because because Makari actually has very minimal hit points, so I'm going to do this. No, sorry, not minimal hit points. Makari actually has quite high hit points, so if I'm able to take him down, his death blow ability on my side will actually be pretty significant. Yeah, 65. Not as much as I was hoping for, but still not bad. And I'm going to be, this guy's death blow is going to be really significant. Oh, well, there we go. All right. Oh, nuts. Of course, the big game hunter range guy is right across from my big game. But I guess half my board is big game too, so it's not that surprising. But that's still good because my biggest melee hitter is hitting a guy who has low health. And that is one thing too, is that the melee attack, I probably don't have enough to kill him with that debuff. That was a good debuff. Yeah, okay. So if your melee attack is hard enough and your initial melee attack that infects a card is high enough to kill it, that is really good because that will, oh nice, and that'll kill him and trigger his death blow back, yeah. Because you can one hit a card and it will still explode like a bomb. So if you have a really, really, really hard melee hit, you can use that and actually really benefit from it. And so this is, it's got 21, 40 something. Yeah, there we go. And this should really help me clear through because it's my turn. Ah, endless. But those guys are just total scrubs, even with the bonus from Zodgrod. And I one-shot him, so he will do his infection. No, there he goes. So I one-shot him, so he will then immediately hit this guy to the right. So you can see that if you hit something hard enough on that initial hit, it still will trigger your explosive extra damage. And this I should have easily in the bag. This is a much easier matchup, somewhat lower leveled, and again, the AI deployed it backwards. Had this deck played the way a human would, where these cheap guys were played first, and then those two brawlers came out at the end, I would have been in bad shape. But so you get lucky in the matchup a little bit sometimes. Splat. But yeah, so hopefully that does highlight how the Parasite works as a Warlord and kind of how interesting it is. If you have the cards to back it up at decent levels, it's a really fun piece. And again, one of my favorite Warlords, one I've been playing with a lot recently. I would not argue yet that it's one of the best Warlords in the Tyranid faction. It's somewhere in the middle, but it does offer a completely new way to interact with the meta and interact with enemy decks. So it's certainly worth looking at. So let me know what you think, and good luck out there.